The borderlands of Cambodia and South Vietnam in 1969 were not marked by signs or fences, only by the sound of war. The jungle itself defined the boundary, thick with bamboo, tangled roots, and humidity that clung to the skin. To the men of the 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment, the Black Horse, this frontier felt less like a map line and more like the edge of the world. It was a place where supply convoys vanished, ambushes came without warning, and every rustle in the grass carried the promise of danger. For weeks, small engagements had flared and faded along Highway 13. Convoys were hit, bridges sabotaged, and patrols ambushed by enemies who melted back into the foliage. The regiment's leadership decided to strengthen its outposts along the approach routes, turning isolated clearings into defensive positions. One of these was Checkpoint Delta, a rise of red clay surrounded by swamp and trees, strategically unremarkable but tactically vital. Whoever held it controlled movement through the corridor leading west into Cambodia. That assignment fell to Sergeant Lester Williams and his tank crew. Williams had been in the Army since the mid-1950s, a veteran of training ranges from Georgia to Germany. He knew the weight of responsibility that came with command, and he knew the odds were never in his favor. As an African-American NCO, he'd seen how expectations changed depending on who gave the orders. In the field, however, tanks were equalizers, a language of steel and firepower that didn't recognize color. Inside his M48 Patton, the only thing that mattered was whether his men could do their jobs, and his crew could. Each man had his rhythm. Corporal Raymond Lewis, a quiet Texan with steady hands, operated the 90mm main gun with practiced precision. Private Alvin Harris, barely 20, handled the ammunition, his arms blackened with grease and powder residue. Specialist Charles Dent, the youngest of the group, drove with instinct, feeling the track tension through the soles of his boots. Together, they made the tank move as one, not graceful but deliberate, a 50-ton heartbeat pulsing through the mud. Their first days at Checkpoint Delta were spent in routine maintenance and watch rotation. The crew slept inside the hull or under ponchos stretched between treads. The air was heavy with rain and diesel fumes. Occasionally, a passing convoy would deliver rations or ammunition, but most of the time they were alone. At dusk, the jungle swallowed all light, and the sounds grew. Frogs, cicadas, and somewhere distant, artillery rolling like thunder. The Viet Cong rarely attacked at random. They studied patterns, waited for fatigue to dull vigilance. Williams made sure his men never relaxed. By the third night, even the insects seemed to go quiet. Harris noticed first, a silence that pressed against the eardrums. Then came faint vibrations through the ground, the kind that only armored soldiers could recognize. Movement. Williams climbed halfway out of the hatch, scanning the tree line through infrared binoculars. There, flashes of heat, dozens of them, maybe more, moving low and fast between the trees. He didn't need to confirm. He ducked back in, sealing the hatch with a metallic clang. "Engines on," he ordered calmly. Dent twisted the ignition, and the diesel engine roared to life. The crew's world shrank to red-lit instruments and the intercom's static hiss. Williams checked the ammo count. 30 HE rounds, 12 canister shells, and a belt of .5 caliber linked across the feed tray. He loaded the first shell himself, a ritual of focus before the chaos. Outside, the first flashes came, RPGs streaking through the darkness like comets, their warheads slamming into the mud around the tank. Dirt and fire erupted across the clearing. Lewis swung the turret and returned fire, his first shell bursting in the trees, lighting the jungle in orange flame. Harris shouted over the intercom, "They're all around us!" Williams steadied his voice. "Good, that means we can see them." Minutes became seconds. The radios crackled with half-words from nearby platoons. "Contact! Heavy fire! No air support!" The reality sank in. They were on their own. Reinforcements were too far south, and the road was already compromised. Every crewman knew it, but no one spoke the thought aloud. They'd been ordered to hold the border, and that was exactly what they would do. The tank rocked as Dent reversed over the rise, bringing the gun's elevation level with the tree line. Lewis fired again. Another explosion ripped through the jungle, this time closer, scattering enemy silhouettes in the glow. The coaxial machine gun opened up, a steady rhythm of metallic fury. William's voice came through the intercom like iron. "Keep that barrel hot!" Inside the hull, the air was suffocating, a mix of heat, cordite, and adrenaline. Harris's hands bled from handling the shell casings, but he didn't slow. Lewis fired again and again, each recoil shaking dust from the ceiling. Dent maneuvered in short jerks, keeping them from being a stationary target. The tank groaned but held, every impact echoing like a heartbeat. When a rocket finally hit the right track, the jolt threw everyone against the walls. Warning lights flashed. "Track's jammed," Dent shouted. "We're not moving." Williams gritted his teeth. "Then we'll fight where we stand." He opened the top hatch, climbed halfway out, and unleashed the .50 caliber machine gun into the tree line. Brass rained down on the turret. The enemy fire intensified, but the tank did not budge. Hours later, the first assault faltered. Smoke rolled across the clearing, glowing faintly in the moonlight. The ground was littered with broken weapons and bodies. Williams' crew sat in silence, drenched in sweat, the engine still rumbling like a pulse beneath their feet. Dent exhaled slowly. "They thought we'd run." Williams looked through the periscope toward the shattered tree line and replied, "Then they don't know who we are." The jungle around them hissed with steam and silence once more. Checkpoint Delta was still in American hands. Against the odds, and against every expectation, a black tank crew had held the line at the edge of the border, alone but unbroken. The night had proven one thing beyond doubt. Courage didn't need to move to make history. It just needed to stand its ground. The first explosions rolled across the clearing like thunder, throwing mud and fire into the air. The M48 Patton shuddered under the impact, its armor ringing with the sound of steel under pressure. Inside the turret, the light flickered red from the instrument panels, the intercom crackling with static. Williams' voice was steady, deliberate, commanding through the chaos. "Gunner, fire! Loader, next round ready!" Lewis and Harris moved in sync, a rhythm born from repetition, not thought. The main gun roared, and the jungle ahead vanished in a storm of smoke and splintered wood. Outside, the grass burned. RPG trails arced low, some bursting harmlessly in the air, others slamming into the earth with concussive force. Each detonation threw fragments that pinged against the tank's hull like hail. The crew could hear bullets striking the steel, thousands of them, shallow, angry taps that never stopped. Williams adjusted his periscope and saw flashes of movement in the tree line. Silhouettes moving fast and low, carrying tubes on their shoulders. "VC with rockets," he called out. "Front left." Lewis traversed the turret, fired, and the 90mm shell tore through the brush, silencing the threat. The enemy's plan was clear: overwhelm the tanks with numbers. Through the haze, dozens of Viet Cong crept closer, using the tall grass for cover. Some dragged wounded men, others crawled forward clutching grenades. The coaxial machine gun spat in short bursts, cutting through the stalks, leaving trails of fire where tracer rounds ignited dry vegetation. Harris shouted range corrections between loads, his hands slick with sweat and blood. When the first RPG hit near the right track, the blast rocked the entire vehicle. The tank heaved, treads grinding against mud, but it stayed upright. Dent's hands flew over the controls, maneuvering them half a meter backward, enough to reset their position.
"Track's good," Dent called. "Then keep her dancing," Williams barked back. He switched frequencies to contact the other tanks. Static, then a broken voice from 2nd Platoon. "Delta 3's hit! Turret down! We're burning!" Williams slammed his fist against the radio casing, but said nothing. He knew what that meant. One flank was gone. Their triangle was breaking. The tank's interior grew hotter with each round fired. The ventilation fans couldn't keep up with the smoke pouring through small seams in the turret. Harris's arm shook as he pushed another shell into the breach. Lewis's face was expressionless, eyes fixed on the gun sight. The recoil slammed his shoulder every few seconds. They were all drenched, part sweat, part condensation. Each breath tasted of gunpowder and metal. Outside, the field was chaos. Flames licked up through the grass, throwing shadows of advancing figures. The Viet Cong had close to within 50 yards, their outlines visible against the fire. Small arms rattled like chains, and grenades burst against the perimeter. Williams opened the commander's hatch briefly and fired the .5 caliber machine gun across the slope, sweeping a dozen meters at a time. The weapon's thunder drowned out the smaller sounds, but only for a moment. The next volley of rockets came in, one slamming into a nearby tree, another striking the turret's side. Sparks showered through the commander's cupola. Then came the scream from Harris, sharp, cut short. A molten shard from the last explosion had pierced his forearm, searing the flesh. Williams turned, saw the blood running down his loader's sleeve. "Sit tight," he said, tearing open a bandage pack. Harris tried to protest, still reaching for the next shell. "You ain't stopping now," Williams told him. "We've got too many friends outside counting on us." He tied off the bandage, pushed the shell into the loader's hands, and turned back to the periscope. Lewis kept firing, each shot timed to the rhythm of survival. The recoil jolted the entire tank, shaking loose dust from the ceiling. "Range 150, he said flatly. "Enemy squad on the move." The next round blew a crater where the silhouettes had been seconds before. The heat inside the turret was unbearable. Sweat ran into their eyes, the gunmetal burned to the touch, and the floor vibrated like an engine under strain. Dent's knuckles were white on the controls. He maneuvered the 50-ton machine as if it were alive, keeping it angled toward the tree line, never staying still long enough to be an easy mark. Through the driver's slit, he caught glimpses of fire, yellow bursts in the blackness, the jungle flickering as if alive. He didn't need orders anymore. The tank's survival depended on rhythm, not command. By 3 a.m., the gunfire began to thin. The last RPGs came weakly, as if fired in desperation. The grass burned in wide arcs now, exposing what was left of the attackers, a handful of retreating shadows disappearing into the smoke. Williams kept his turret aimed west, unwilling to believe it was over. He ordered 2 more illumination rounds fired, bright white stars hissing overhead, revealing a battlefield littered with bodies, helmets, and the remains of weapons. "Cease fire," he finally said, voice rough from shouting. The words hung heavy in the turret. Lewis exhaled, resting his head against the gun sight. Harris slumped against the wall, still clutching his arm. Dent shut off the engine, and for the first time in hours, there was silence. They opened the hatches cautiously. The night air was cooler than the inferno they had left inside. The ground around them was torn to pieces. Shell craters, burnt grass, the twisted metal of unexploded ordnance. The other tanks stood blackened and smoking, their crews emerging slowly, faces gray with soot. One of them raised a hand in salute. Williams nodded back. As dawn broke, the smoke thinned to reveal the full scene. Dozens of Viet Cong lay motionless where they had fallen, their uniforms darkened by mud and ash. The clearing that had been green the day before was now a wasteland of flame and silence.
The tank's right track was cracked, its armor scarred by a dozen impacts. But it still stood. Inside, the crew began counting ammunition. Only a few shells left, less than half a belt of .50 caliber rounds. Williams wrote brief notes for his report on a scrap of paper, the pencil trembling in his hand. "Position held," he wrote. "Casualties minor. Enemy strength heavy. Morale unbroken." He tucked the paper into his jacket and looked out toward the horizon. Reinforcements were still hours away. The radio was quiet, except for the faint hum of static. Harris leaned against the hatch, exhausted but alive. Lewis began cleaning the barrel, his movements slow but steady. Dent lit a cigarette, staring at the smoldering tree line. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. They had survived the night the enemy thought would end them. The fire in the grass still smoldered, and in its light, the black tank crew of Checkpoint Delta became something more than survivors. They became proof that courage can sit still and burn just as fiercely as any flame. The sun had barely cleared the treetops when the first mortars began to fall. Their descent was almost silent, ending in concussions that lifted the ground beneath the tanks and rained clods of mud on the turrets. Inside his M48, Sergeant Lester Williams gripped the intercom headset, barking orders through the static. "Hatches sealed, engine check, ready main gun." The morning haze was soon replaced by smoke and dust. The second assault had begun, heavier, closer, and far more coordinated than before. The Viet Cong had adjusted their tactics overnight. Where the first attack had been a chaotic rush, this one was measured, tactical. Spotters hidden in the tree line directed mortar fire with precision. Shells bracketed the American positions, walking closer with each impact. The air shimmered with heat and dust as fragments tore through the foliage. Williams could hear the thud of explosions across the line, the regiment's left flank taking the worst of it. Through the periscope, he saw one tank engulfed in black smoke, its crew scrambling out through the hatch. "They're coming for the flanks," he said. "Gunner, sweep the left." Lewis, his face streaked with soot, adjusted his scope and fired. The 90mm shell disappeared into the tree line, followed by an eruption of flame and splintered wood. Harris reloaded immediately, his wounded arm trembling as he pushed another shell into the breach. Blood darkened his sleeve, but he didn't speak a word. Williams noticed the color draining from his face. "You hold on, Private," he said sharply. "We're not done yet." Harris only nodded and kept working. Outside, the jungle boiled with movement. The enemy was using smoke grenades to advance unseen, gray clouds rolling across the field. It was clever. It blinded the tank optics and dulled the gunners' visibility. But it also gave them a target. Williams switched to the .50 caliber, firing into the densest clouds, each burst tearing through the veil and revealing fleeting silhouettes. The coaxial gun joined in, the sound a steady metallic roar. Each impact sent vibrations through the tank's hull, rattling loose tools and empty shell casings. The second wave came in three directions, a coordinated push from the east and west with a diversionary attack from the front. Williams recognized the pattern, standard NVA assault doctrine. He'd seen it before in training briefings. Overwhelm, isolate, destroy. "They're trying to box us in," he muttered. "Not today." Dent adjusted the tank's position, moving backward just enough to gain elevation, the tracks grinding against the clay. The Patton's engine roared again, shaking the surrounding air. Then a flash, bright, instantaneous, and the world outside turned to fire. An RPG had struck the flank of the neighboring tank, igniting its fuel. Flames erupted from the turret hatch, and three figures stumbled out, their uniforms smoking. Without hesitation, Williams opened his hatch and shouted, "Get to us! Move!"
He climbed halfway out, exposing himself to the open air as bullets whipped past. The burning crew ran through the mud, one falling halfway, dragged by the others. Williams and Dent reached out, hauling them in through the commander's hatch. Inside the cramped steel compartment, chaos reigned. 7 men now, packed shoulder to shoulder, the air a toxic mixture of gun smoke, diesel, and sweat. Lewis kept firing. His arms trembled from recoil, but his precision never faltered. The main gun blasted rhythmically, every discharge rocking the entire tank. 1 o'clock, 30 meters, Williams shouted, and Lewis turned the turret, fired again. The shell detonated in the grass, sending bodies and debris skyward. The Viet Cong kept coming, their shouts echoing through the din of battle. It was no longer an assault. It was a test of endurance, of who would break first.
By noon, ammunition was running low. The auxiliary engine hummed weakly, straining to power the turret's hydraulic rotation. Harris's hands were numb, his vision swimming, but he refused to stop. When Williams ordered him to rest, he only replied, "Not until we're empty." Dent, sweat pouring down his neck, checked the fuel gauge, nearly dry. They'd been fighting for hours, and every second stretched into eternity.
The radio crackled suddenly. Through static came a faint voice from headquarters. "Black Horse units, hold your ground. Relief column moving north. ETA 1 hour." Williams didn't respond. 1 hour might as well have been forever. He looked around at his men, faces streaked with grime, eyes wide but steady, and knew they had only one option: keep firing until the barrels went cold. At 12:30, the final push came. The NVA broke cover, charging through the smoke with rifles and RPGs, a wave of silhouettes moving like shadows through fire. Williams gave no speech, no order to inspire. He simply said, "Gunner, fire for effect." Lewis squeezed the trigger, and the 90mm cannon answered with thunder. The recoil slammed through the tank like a pulse, rhythmic and relentless. Harris, shaking with fatigue, jammed shell after shell into the breach. The machine guns roared again, cutting down figures that came too close. The explosions merged into one continuous noise. The ground shook as the shells struck, the air thick with smoke and dust. When the final RPG hit, a glancing blow against the rear hull, the crew barely flinched. They had passed beyond fear, beyond exhaustion. The tank's armor smoked, dented but intact. Williams looked through the periscope one last time and saw what he had been waiting for. The enemy faltering, breaking formation, retreating into the tree line. By 1 p.m., the battlefield was quiet except for the crackle of small fires. Reinforcements rolled in from the south, armored personnel carriers and medevac choppers circling overhead. The relief convoy found the tanks still standing, their hulls blackened and steaming, surrounded by empty shell casings and cratered earth. Williams climbed out first, his legs stiff from hours of strain. The sun burned through the haze, lighting a scene of devastation. Twisted weapons, burned trees, and silence where there had been chaos. Medics approached, but he waved them off, gesturing instead to Harris, whose arm was bound with a strip of torn fabric. "Start with him," he said simply. The rest of the crew emerged behind him, blinking in the harsh light, their faces ghostly pale beneath layers of soot. Later, as engineers counted the dead, the scale of the fight became clear. Over 100 enemy soldiers lay across the clearing. The tanks had fired nearly every shell they carried. Their position, though battered, still stood. Among the regiment, whispers began to spread about the black tank crew that refused to yield, that stayed and fought when retreat was impossible. For the men of Williams' crew, no words were needed. They sat on the hull of their tank, silent, watching smoke drift west toward Cambodia.
They had faced 200 men and survived. Their armor was dented, their nerves shattered, but their line had held, the line that no one else thought could. By sunrise, the battle zone near Checkpoint Delta no longer resembled a jungle. The once green canopy had been blasted into stumps and ash, the earth churned by artillery and tank fire into deep, water-filled craters. Smoke still curled upward from the blackened grass, and the smell of diesel mixed with gunpowder hung heavy in the humid air. The engineers who arrived at dawn moved carefully, stepping over shell fragments and broken helmets, documenting what the night had turned into, a graveyard of weapons and men. Sergeant Lester Williams stood beside his tank, its once olive armor now charred black, streaked with soot and oil. He had removed his helmet, revealing a face streaked with grime and exhaustion. His crew moved slowly, like men learning to walk again after confinement. They had spent more than a day sealed in that steel coffin, fighting without pause. Their eyes were bloodshot, their voices hoarse, their uniforms stiff with sweat. When they finally stepped onto solid ground, it felt unfamiliar, too soft, too quiet. The first task was to check for survivors. Medics combed through the field, lifting bodies and calling out in short, practiced tones. Most of what they found belonged to the enemy: shattered RPG tubes, splintered AK-47 stocks, torn web gear scattered in the mud. The 11th Armored Cavalry's own casualties were miraculously few, a handful of wounded, most from shrapnel and concussions. For a fight that had raged for nearly 12 hours, the outcome defied logic. The M48 crews had done what infantry couldn't. They'd made immovable steel out of flesh and will. Williams' tank had taken the worst of it. Engineers counted 12 direct hits from rocket-propelled grenades, 2 on the treads, 1 glancing near the turret ring that should have penetrated but didn't. The mechanics who examined it the next day stared in disbelief. "She's a miracle," one said, tracing a finger over a dented panel. "That tank should have been dead 3 times over." The armor had held by inches. The crew's survival was something no manual could explain. The medevac helicopter arrived mid-morning, its rotors scattering ashes across the clearing. Harris, pale but conscious, was the first to go. His bandaged arm rested across his chest as 2 medics lifted him aboard. Before they closed the door, he looked at Williams, forcing a tired smile. "You told us not to move," he said quietly, "and we didn't." Williams nodded once. It wasn't a farewell. It was an acknowledgement of something that words couldn't stretch around. That single line spread through the regiment like folklore. Men repeated it in mess tents and repair bays. "You told us not to move, and we didn't." It became shorthand for defiance, a quiet declaration that ordinary soldiers could hold a line when no one expected them to. There were no official citations, no front-page stories, but among the troopers of the 11th Armored Cavalry, the black tank crew of Checkpoint Delta became legend. The official reports were less poetic. "Enemy repulsed," they read. "No significant friendly losses." Headquarters logged it as a skirmish, one more anonymous engagement along the Cambodian border. No one outside the regiment knew how close that line had come to breaking, or how 4 men inside a burning tank had kept it from collapsing altogether. The Army's bureaucracy reduced it to statistics. For Williams and his men, it remained something far less abstract: the night they refused to yield. After the evacuation, Williams oversaw the field recovery operation. The engineers cleared unexploded ordnance, while mechanics worked to restart the immobilized tanks. The air was alive with the metallic whine of tools and the thud of shovels in wet earth. Every crater told a story. Some were shallow, evidence of near misses. Others, deep and blackened, marked where men had fallen. Williams moved methodically from one site to another, clipboard in hand, recording damages. His handwriting was steady, no embellishment, no emotion, just facts. When asked by his commanding officer how he managed to hold under fire, Williams gave the same answer he would repeat for years afterward. We had orders to stay put, so we did. There was no bravado in it, no claim of heroism. He viewed the fight as part of the job, brutal, necessary, and done correctly. Later that day, when he sat down to write the official after-action report, it was 3 sentences long. Crew morale remained high, ammunition exhausted, position held. It was as stark and unyielding as the man himself. That report, filed among hundreds of others, would go unnoticed in archives for decades. Yet within the regiment it carried weight. Younger soldiers spoke of it in quiet respect, not because of what it said, but because of what it implied. Courage didn't need witnesses. In a war increasingly defined by television broadcasts and politics, the crew of Williams' tank had fought in near total obscurity. They didn't fight for recognition. They fought because no one else was left to do it. By the second evening, as the engineers finished clearing the field, rain began to fall. The water turned the battlefield into a mirror, reflecting the blackened trees, the twisted tank tracks, and the streaks of orange rust where steel met mud. Williams stood beneath the drizzle, helmet back on, inspecting the perimeter one last time. The smell of smoke still lingered, stubborn and heavy. Behind him, Lewis and Dent worked silently, covering the tank's damaged sections with tarpaulin. Their movements were slow but precise, the practiced care of men who understood machines better than they did words. When the column finally rolled out that night, the clearing was left as it was, cratered, scorched, and silent. To anyone passing later, it would look like a forgotten patch of jungle. But for those who had fought there, it was more than coordinates on a map. It was proof that men who had once been doubted, sidelined, or underestimated had stood unflinching under impossible fire. In the larger narrative of the Vietnam War, Checkpoint Delta was just another battle, unnamed, undocumented, soon buried beneath larger headlines. But for the men who lived it, it became something permanent. As Williams cleaned the soot from his hands that night, he looked once more at the scarred hull of his tank and thought not of glory or revenge, but of endurance, the simple, relentless will to stand and hold, even when the world around you falls apart. The months after the fight at Checkpoint Delta unfolded in a strange, suspended rhythm. Not peace, but a quieter kind of war. The 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment moved north, deeper into War-Zone C, where the borderlands thickened into a maze of rivers and bomb craters. For Sergeant Lester Williams and his men, the terrain was new, but the feeling was the same, a constant waiting for something to start again. They cleaned their tank, patched its armor with steel plates cut from wreckage, and got back to routine. There were no speeches, no reporters, and no letters of praise. The Army had already moved on to its next campaign. Within the regiment, however, the story of the stand at Delta refused to die. It passed from crew to crew like an unspoken oath. Mechanics repeated it to new arrivals while tightening bolts on tank tracks. Infantrymen mentioned it when talking about Black Horse grit. For many African American soldiers, who were still fighting skepticism from white officers and resentment in the rear areas, the tale of Williams' crew became more than a rumor. It was evidence that the rules of judgment in Vietnam were different from those at home. Under fire, there was no color, only competence. By early summer 1969, the crew had been reassigned to another forward position near Khartoum, supporting patrols along the supply routes that cut through the Cambodian jungle. The work was relentless but impersonal, escorting convoys, clearing roads, standing watch in heat thick enough to choke a man. The war had shifted into attrition, a daily grind of movement and maintenance. Williams led his tank as he always had, precise and unsentimental. His command style had earned him quiet respect. He shouted rarely, delegated clearly, and kept his crew alive. Promotion came in September. The ceremony lasted 10 minutes, a handshake, a chevron pinned crookedly to his sleeve, a brief mention of leadership under pressure. The citation made no reference to the April battle. Williams didn't mind. Afterward, he went back to the motor pool and helped Dent strip the tank's engine housing. That evening, he shared coffee with the new loader, a 19-year-old from Detroit, who asked him what it felt like to be a hero. Williams smiled faintly and said, "It felt hot, loud, and heavy, same as today. We just didn't stop moving." In private moments, though, the past lingered. Harris, recovering from his arm wound at a field hospital, sent letters to the crew describing his return to the States. He wrote about the parade he didn't attend, the questions no one asked. "They don't know what it means to hold still and not break," he wrote. Williams kept that line folded in his wallet. The war's bureaucracy might forget, but the men who had shared that tank would not. Among black troops in the 11th, that memory took on symbolic weight. At a time when racial tension was spilling through rear bases, fights in clubs, insults in chow lines, unofficial segregation in housing, the example of Williams' crew stood apart. They had done what the institution still doubted them capable of: command under pressure. To younger soldiers, their stand became a point of pride, whispered in mess halls. When rumors spread of new assaults near the border, tankers joked, "Send the crew that didn't move an inch." It was half humor, half reverence. The 11th Armored Cavalry kept rotating through combat zones. Its units scattered from Tay Ninh to Phuoc Long. The faces changed. The tanks did not. The M48s rolled through mud and fire, their crews surviving by the same discipline that had saved Williams. In those long, humid nights when the jungle pressed close and radio chatter filled the air, men still talked about that April fight, how 4 African-American tankers had held off hundreds without retreating. It wasn't a story told with fanfare. It was told quietly, with respect. In official circles, the incident surfaced only briefly. A regimental newsletter mentioned a display of exceptional armor defense along the Cambodian frontier, crediting unnamed crews for stabilizing the line under heavy enemy assault. It was the Army's way of acknowledging courage without rewriting policy. The draft continued, the protests at home grew louder, and the command preferred stories that fit the narrative of progress and control. 4 men in a tank didn't fit that narrative, not when they represented what the country was still struggling to admit, that valor and equality were inseparable. When the monsoon season came, bringing weeks of relentless rain, Williams' new crew spent most of their time maintaining equipment. Between shifts, they traded memories, what it felt like to hear rounds ping against the hull, the way the ground trembled under the gun's recoil, the silence afterward. Williams listened, rarely speaking unless to correct a detail. He wasn't a storyteller, he was a technician of survival. "You do the job or you don't," he would say, "that's all." But the younger men watched him the way soldiers watch those who've been tested, not for stories, but for guidance on how to last. In October, a visiting colonel inspected the regiment. He stopped by Williams' position, asking perfunctory questions about maintenance schedules. Before leaving, he said, "Heard you boys made a stand back in April. Good work." The compliment was casual, almost accidental. Yet to Williams' men, it was proof that their story had reached higher than the motor pool, that somewhere in the command chain their stand had been recognized, even if unofficially. Williams didn't reply. He simply nodded and returned to the tank, wiping oil from his hands. Recognition, he understood, didn't always come with ceremony. As 1969 turned into 1970, the war's tone shifted. Troop withdrawals began, and with them came a sense of exhaustion. The veterans of the earlier campaigns rotated home, replaced by younger soldiers who carried less experience and more doubt. By then, most of Williams' original crew had scattered. Harris in recovery, Lewis reassigned to a training unit, Dent rotated stateside. The empty seats inside the tank felt heavier than the steel itself. Williams trained replacements, patient but distant, always measuring them against ghosts. When asked later about the night at Checkpoint Delta, he summarized it the same way every time. It was 4 men doing their jobs, that's all. But to those who heard it, especially the younger black troopers, the words carried more than humility. They carried a kind of quiet defiance, a reminder that history didn't need to remember them for the truth to exist.
By mid-1970, Williams knew his time in Vietnam was ending. He received his orders for rotation in August and spent his final weeks overseeing equipment transfers. On his last day in country, he stood beside the same M48 he had commanded through hell. The scars on its armor had been repainted, the dents filled, but the faint outlines remained. He ran a hand along the steel, feeling the roughness beneath the new coat of paint. It wasn't sentimentality, it was acknowledgement. Machines, like men, carried memory in the marks they survived.
When he left Vietnam, there were no cameras at the airfield, no formal farewell. His name never appeared in print. But inside the regiment, his story had already become a part of its unwritten code, proof that duty and courage could coexist without applause. The crew that didn't move an inch would not enter textbooks or official archives for decades. Yet among those who served beside them, that silence was its own kind of recognition. Quiet, unrecorded, but unshakably real. And so, as the war dragged on and the headlines shifted, the legend remained where it had always belonged, not in reports or parades, but in memory. The kind of memory that soldiers carry like dog tags, worn smooth by time, yet impossible to forget. By the time historians began to reconstruct the battle, much of its physical evidence had vanished into the jungle. The coordinates once marked on field maps were blurred by rain and decades of erosion. The trees had grown back over the scarred earth, and the ground that had burned beneath rocket fire now looked like any other patch of wilderness along the Cambodian border. But the records that survived, fragments of after-action reports, maintenance logs, and interviews conducted years later, all pointed to the same conclusion. Somewhere near the edge of War Zone C in April 1969, a black tank crew from the 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment had made an impossible stand. When historians from the U.S. Army's Center of Military History began oral interviews in the 1980s, the name Lester Williams surfaced again and again. By then, Williams was long retired, living quietly in Baltimore. He worked as a diesel mechanic, wore his service cap only on Memorial Day, and avoided public speaking. When a researcher called to ask about the fight, he paused for a long time before answering. "I remember smoke," he finally said, "and noise. We were told to hold, so we did." It was all he ever offered, the same phrase he had used in his report, stripped of pride or bitterness, distilled to its plainest truth. For Williams and his men, heroism had never been the goal. They hadn't expected medals or attention. They had expected survival. The Army at the time rarely celebrated isolated armor engagements, especially those involving predominantly black crews. Recognition flowed upward, to the commanders who signed reports, not the men who filled them with action. What endured instead was reputation. Inside the 11th Armored Cavalry, the crew that didn't move an inch became shorthand for fortitude under fire. Drill sergeants repeated the story to new recruits, stripping it of names but preserving its lesson. When ordered to hold, you hold. By the late 1970s, the regiment had rotated out of Vietnam, and the war itself was fading from the national conversation. Yet among veterans' reunions, the legend persisted. Letters exchanged between tankers, many now scattered across the United States, included half-remembered details. The night sky streaked with tracers, the smell of burning oil, the sound of voices shouting over the intercom. Harris, who had survived his wounds, sent a note to a former comrade in 1973. "Tell them we didn't run, even when we should have. That's all they need to know." For men who had lived through a war often defined by confusion and withdrawal, that sentence became a moral anchor. The significance of what they had done stretched beyond tactics. In 1969, the U.S. Army was still struggling with internal divisions, racial tension, inequity in promotions, and widespread mistrust between white officers and black enlisted soldiers. Armor units were no exception. Many commanders privately questioned the readiness of integrated crews. The stand at Checkpoint Delta challenged those prejudices in the most direct way possible. Under fire, the African American tankers had not only performed, they had outlasted everyone's expectations. Their discipline, communication, and precision during the battle were later cited in regimental training sessions as examples of textbook armored defense, though their names were rarely mentioned. Williams himself never claimed credit. When local veterans groups invited him to speak, he would politely decline, saying only that the men did what they were trained to do. His humility was genuine, but it also masked a deeper truth. He didn't want the war to define him. The world he returned to in 1975 was restless and divided. The word Vietnam carried bitterness, not pride. For a black veteran, that silence was doubled. A war unrecognized, fought in a country that still hesitated to recognize him fully. So he worked, raised a family, and said little. Yet his reputation within the regiment followed him quietly, like a shadow that needed no light. When the 11th Armored Cavalry held its 50th anniversary gathering in 1987, several of Williams' peers brought up the border engagement during the speeches. They recalled the night their radios went silent and how the reports of Delta Company tanks holding fast had reached command. One officer, then a lieutenant, described how that single stand had stabilized an entire sector. If those tanks had broken, he said, the border would have fallen apart for weeks. Instead, they stayed put, and everyone else took courage from that. Afterward, veterans raised a toast, not to medals or victories, but to endurance. In official Army archives, the engagement remains a footnote, a single paragraph buried in a 1,000-page report. But in the oral histories that followed, its meaning deepened. For many who studied Vietnam's small unit actions, the episode came to represent the essence of the conflict. Isolated soldiers fighting unseen, unsupported, and often uncredited. Yet, through skill and stubbornness, they imposed order on chaos. The line that held, one historian called it, not a place on a map, but a principle. That phrase would later title a short documentary made by a group of military historians in the 1990s. It included interviews with surviving members of the 11th Armored Cavalry and brief commentary from William's son, who described growing up unaware of his father's actions. He didn't talk about it, he said. I found out from another veteran. When I asked him, he just said, we stayed where we were told. I think that's all he ever wanted people to know. The film never aired widely, but among veteran circles it found quiet resonance. The story wasn't about medals or strategy, it was about resolve. The men of that crew had faced overwhelming odds, not with speeches or fury, but with a calm, relentless professionalism. Their defiance wasn't loud, it was mechanical, methodical, unwavering. In a war where so much was lost to confusion, their stand offered something clean and unambiguous, proof that duty, even when thankless, could still mean something enduring. By the time Williams passed away in 1994, few outside the Armored Corps knew his name. His obituary in the Baltimore Sun mentioned only his rank, his service in Vietnam, and his later work as a mechanic. But at the bottom, written by a fellow veteran, was a single line. He never moved an inch. It was both epitaph and testimony, a summary of character compressed into 5 words. Today, the story of the black tank crew at Checkpoint Delta exists mostly in fragments, recollections, regimental newsletters, and veterans' accounts preserved by archivists who refuse to let them disappear. In an era when technology records everything, their legacy survives not through photographs or film, but through voices. It lives in the quiet tone of men who remember a night of fire and metal when a handful of soldiers, outnumbered and underestimated, stood against the tide and did not break. And so the legend endures, a chapter without glamour, a victory without celebration. The Viet Cong thought they'd flee. Instead, they anchored themselves to a patch of earth and proved that courage could be as simple as stillness. The jungle reclaimed the battlefield. The reports faded into archives, but the meaning remained untouched. They were the men who faced 200 enemies and didn't yield. They were the line that held, not just for a night, but for every soldier who ever needed proof that steadfastness, in the end, is its own form of triumph.